All right, everyone, we're going to get started. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you guys coming to our new Chandler office here. My name is Nick Flores. I lead the nonprofit and human service practice for the Mahoney Group. We're really excited to see you all, and all you folks on Zoom, thanks for joining us. Today's topic is a sobering one, but one that we think is very important. You know, some of the hardest phone calls we get as insurance advisors are calls about abuse. They're very expensive claims and they cause a lot of trauma, but what they do to people is even worse. And so I'm sure those of you who have taken these phone calls know how impactful they can be, and they're very impactful for us today. So we're grateful for Selective coming today and giving us this presentation. I have the honor of introducing Katie Ball and Pat Rafferty. Katie is an executive agency management specialist in Arizona for Selective Insurance. She graduated from the University of Arizona and has nearly 24 years of insurance experience. 20 of those years were with me, right, Katie? So we were just joking. How did that happen? Her first role was the personal lines claims management adjuster. Today, Katie focuses on nonprofit and human service providers in the state of Arizona, and she also works with senior living facilities, schools, and other organizations just like yours. Katie is a certified Praesidium guardian, and we'll talk more about what that means later today. Our other presenter is Pat Rafferty. I've only worked with Pat for 10 years, but still for a very long time. Pat is the Select Business Segment Management Director, covering the West and some of the Midwest states as well. He graduated from Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington, and has over 20 years of insurance experience, mostly in underwriting. Like Katie, Pat spends a lot of his time in nonprofits, human services, schools, and senior living. Also like Katie, Pat is a Praesidium guardian as well. Katie and Pat, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate that.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Nick had alluded to, my name is Katie Ball. I'm happy to be with you all today to get into all things in regards to abuse prevention. We'll go into Praesidium and what their model is. We've provided you a handout. It's in front of your seat. If you want to flip actually to the back of it, you'll see the blue page that has the Praesidium matrix on the back. And we're going to go through each of those areas and we get into the presentation. And really how we're going to use this presentation is to do a deep dive on your organization. The goal and intent today is for you to walk out of this room or Zoom and understand where there might be some holes in your organization and what are some things that you can do immediately with the help of the Mahoney Group, Selective, and Praesidium to make some improvements. Just as a reminder, these are some presentations with opinions expressed from the information from Praesidium. I just have to put a disclosure in there, but we'll get into it right now. So who is Praesidium? Praesidium is a company that's been around for over 30 years. They come out of Texas. The founder was a board member for the YMCA, and unfortunately he was involved with the details of a horrific abuse claim. And as a doctor and as an individual that wants to make things right in the community, he just felt that abuse could be preventable. And so over 30 years ago, he started studying ways to prevent abuse from happening and created a risk management model that we're going to follow and get into the details of today. So to become a CPG, myself and Pat, among others, spent 3 days going through training. We got into the details of every single segment in the matrix that we're going to go through today. So what we're taking to you is really a 1 hour kind of a crash course in regards to what we did for 3 days. So we have a lot of additional information for you from handouts, to conversations with your advisor, for you to walk away with some additional information for your organization. So feel free, please, to come and talk to us. We know that 1 hour does not really cover everything we need to cover because this topic is so important and so large, but we want to make sure we're giving you high-level information that's actionable to your organization. So the safety equation is Praesidium's registered trademark. We're going to go through each one of these matrix today and do a deep dive of how all of these together will create a safe environment. So why is abuse an issue? We have a multitude of things that have happened over the last decade. We had the Me Too movement. We had a significant increase above 300% of child-to-child and peer-to-peer abuse allegations. We've had statute of repose as well as limitations change. Obviously, we have various states that now don't even have a statute of limitations any longer. A lot of the areas within abuse have opened up the legal environment to have it be addressed, be persecuted, be charged, and for those with lifelong experiences or experiences that happened years ago, they can now come forward and have their cases be heard and settled. And so this is making a significant impact in insurance. And what Selective has decided to do is really dive in deep and help our customers with Praesidium to make sure we put you in a position to do the best for your organization to avoid some of the pitfalls because of these trending areas. The area that, one thing that always hits me the most is 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys are victims of abuse, whether that be peer-to-peer, adult to child, whatever the situation, or adult to a vulnerable population. That's a staggering number. And 80% of those cases go unreported. And so our job is to keep kids safe, vulnerable populations safe, and that's what we're here to do. Electronic communication. I mean, how many of you now have 1 or 2 phones on you, right? At all times, right? Work phone, personal phone. Who has kids in this room, right? Many of us. They have their phones with them. They are able to have someone connect with them that you don't know about, right? And from our standpoint, this is an area that has just ballooned, whether it be peer-to-peer bullying, whether it be a predator that's reaching out to a vulnerable population or your kids. I even talk about, my kid, he had someone take a picture of him and superimpose it on an image and then try to extort him. He's a smart kid too, right? But he didn't come to us to tell us that this happened. Like, there's so many things that are out there on a day-to-day basis that the electronic communication piece is an area that we see a lot of organizations falling short as far as how they manage that and what their controls and expectations are for their clientele as well as the organization of electronic communication policies. So getting back to the Praesidium model, Praesidium believes that abuse is 100% preventable. But in order to be preventable, we need everyone in the organization to be lockstep in making sure that the right things that are taking place, from the screening and selection, to the policies putting in place, to the feedback loops, to reporting process, it all takes the entire organization being fully committed to make this work. At-risk organizations are all the organizations that are on the Zoom call as well as in this room. I would also extend that into other organizations that you wouldn't necessarily think of. For example, construction. There are some construction organizations that now do work at schools or at ASU or University of Arizona. They are now required to background check their employees and to have an abuse policy in place so that they're keeping the students safe and that we know who's going onto the campus and keeping the predators out and potential issues. Things that we're seeing, which is amazing. It's been such a change over the last really 3 years of organizations really diving into this and creating those policies. There's been a lot more awareness and exposure. Gone are the days that you just bring people into your organization that you feel are just going to do the right thing, right? That a handshake, looking someone in the eyes, knowing that they have good value, a moral compass. Those days, unfortunately, are no longer there. You can't just abide by, a gut feeling that someone is good and that everything's going well. No, you need to have a defined process. And the reason you do is because you're sitting in, a courtroom and someone asks, like, what did your organization do to prevent an issue? And you don't have an explanation for that. We're seeing nuclear verdicts come out impacting an organization because they just don't have the things in process to support their organization and keep the vulnerable population and kids and clients safe. The other areas that, and Mahoney speaks about this all the time, is how do they best help your organization become the best risk manager possible? And the reason they want you to do that is because you have ownership of the risk management, and that puts you in a position that they can find the best coverages and limits for you in a marketplace that continues to limit coverage. They are limiting limits for you. And so really, you're putting yourself in a great position in order to get the best coverages and limits that are available in the marketplace, because it is shrinking. Carriers are getting out of the marketplace completely, or they're severely limiting what they're able to offer, and or increasing prices significantly. I mean, who in this room has had their insurance prices go up over the last several years? Everyone, right? And it goes back to nuclear verdicts. It goes back to organizations that don't have the right risk control and process. So putting yourself in a good place to move forward and have the best offering possible for your organization. And next up.
No, I think you're still.
And then who gets hurt by abuse and an incident? Everybody, family members, communities, organizations. I'll tell you a little personal story. The reason I'm in this right now and why I feel so passionately about Praesidium is because I grew up with a mom who was a nurse who ran the child abuse unit in Boise, Idaho, where I grew up for over 10 years. So I was in I was in her office, right? I would meet the police officers that did the investigation on the cases. We were invited to some of the victims and their families' healing ceremonies. We did the things, and for me, the whole part about abuse being preventable is that it is. It's about doing the right thing in the community for yourself, for your family members, for all involved, because once an incident happened, as Nick alluded to, it's devastating for everybody. It's devastating to your organizational what people believe your organization can and can't do, everybody. And so really important that we make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that abuse is preventable. All right, we talked a little bit about this too. I won't go into all of it. We all know what the effects of abuse on victims can be. And then we talked about abuse organizations as far as threat to program's mission. And then knowing too that these numbers are staggering. 30% are family members, which is a really high statistic. 60% are known to the victim, and only 10% are strangers. So again, when you look at your organization, we see that it's not just the individual that no one knows, right? It's someone that has access, who has potential control, who can really groom the potential victim, and that's what we're trying to avoid as well. As far as coverage forms, sorry, click one too many slides forward. Basic understanding of our abuse and molestation coverage form is really important, something to talk to your Mahoney advisor about. Certain carriers cover abuse like various ways. So really helpful to know if your carrier covers it for physical, mental, and sexual abuse. Other things to look out to are whether or not defense is inside or outside the limits, and whether or not it's a separate endorsement to the GL and a standalone coverage. Those are things you can talk to your advisor about in regards to your specific policy.
Good morning, everyone. So I think it's just important to point out and note the fact that, like, why are we having these conversations? Why is this an important discussion topic? And really, we're trying to benefit your organizations, your clients, to identify the potential exposures associated with abuse and molestation, and then actions that you can take to better protect your organization, better protect your consumers and clients associated with this. So we talk about, you'll probably see this in print material, you'll hear us talk about it. Abuse prevention is a journey. So it's really not just one of those topics where you can set a policy, put something in a manual, gloss over it in training, and then kind of just set that policy and forget about it. This is something that has to be very proactive. It has to be something that starts from the top and trickles down within the organization. And people have to realize that it's not just certain individuals within an organization that are responsible for managing the safety of their consumers and clients. It's really everybody who's affiliated with the organization. Top down, doesn't matter if they're full-time, part-time, volunteers, everybody plays a role in abuse and prevention. So we talk about putting clients, when we're evaluating clients and controls, putting them on a spectrum. And so up here you see the spectrum that we have is we put them in categories of complacency, compliance, and commitment. So what does that mean? Complacency is really defined as the organization who says they don't have an exposure, they're doing everything that they need to from the standpoint, they have that mindset, it'll never happen to us. And obviously, as you can imagine from an organization standpoint, that can be a very tricky view to have. By comparison, compliance are organizations that have policies and procedures in place, and they're usually following some sort of minimum standard. That could be part of an accreditation program, that could be part of a jurisdictional requirement, city, state requirements from that standpoint. So they're actively taking an approach to follow those guidelines, but they're really just doing the bare minimum that's required of them by some third party. Versus commitment, which is what we view as the organizations that are very passionate about their programs and services, very passionate about abuse prevention, and they're very proactive in their programs and services and policies and procedures to support that type of an environment. So how do perpetrators operate? So there's really three elements that we look for when we're talking about abuse and molestation exposures. Is everybody who's going to be potentially engaged in these type of activities needs three things. They need access, they need privacy, and they need control. So what do those things mean? Access is pretty simple, right? Straightforward. They need to have access to your organization. They need to have access to your vulnerable population, consumers and clients. Keep in mind when we're talking about access, it's not just physical interaction. They don't have to be in the same room. They don't have to have physical contact with individuals. We're starting to see a huge trend in online activities and electronic engagements associated with that. So again, each organization has to kind of look at themselves and evaluate their policies, procedures, programs, and services, and figure out where those potential problem areas are going to be. Privacy. So again, most abuse isn't going to take place in public. You're not going to have 20 people in a room and have an incident of abuse or molestation. It's typically going to take place in a one-on-one setting behind closed doors, out of the public eye or mindset. So from an organization standpoint, what can you do from that standpoint to try to eliminate those types of exposures? Look at your organization. How do you provide your programs and services? Where do you provide your programs and services? When do you provide those programs and services? And try to identify where those potential challenging areas may be. And again, the privacy doesn't have to be in person. There's a lot of one-on-one things that take place in online activities, private chat rooms, and things like that. And then the last element is control. And so you'll hear some of these buzzwords, things like grooming, testing, manipulating, gift giving. They're all things that basically violators will use to either play on a power dynamic, and if they have some sort of power or authority over somebody, and they'll try to use that as an opportunity to get into that, or it's just repeated ongoing interactions, giving them small gifts, giving them compliments, kind of testing the waters to see what they can get away with, what they can't get away with. One thing that I think that is interesting with control, we talk about grooming behaviors. So Praesidium does an annual report every year. Their most recent report just came out, and there was a study in there that said 99% of adult survivors of child abuse claim that there was at least one grooming activity involved in their abuse. What's even more staggering to that is the average number of grooming activities that lead up to an incident of abuse is 14. So think about it from an organization standpoint is if the average person has 14 interactions with their violator before the incident of abuse actually occurs, that gives you as an organization 14 opportunities to step in and take corrective action to potentially prevent those situations from escalating further. So we talk about why are policies critical. Obviously it starts, you can't just, try to go in and say we're going to have an abuse prevention policy without having formality with regards to, what's going to be put down in writing or what's going to be incorporated into your organization's mission. So you want to communicate a culture of zero tolerance. So from an organization where we're talking of abuse and molestation, we feel, Praesidium feels that every incident of abuse is preventable, but it starts with you have to have a culture and an organization that supports that mindset. So, we're always looking for organizations that has a zero tolerance. Like there should be, no acceptable amount of inappropriate or inappropriate behavior within an organization. You want to set very clear expectations and guidelines as far as what are unacceptable and what are unacceptable behaviors and interactions associated with this. Again, this is a broad spectrum. There's a variety of different consumers and clients that we're working with, and some of these will vary dependent on the programs and services that they're offering. But you definitely want to make sure you set very clear boundaries, that you communicate those boundaries both internally to your organization, staff, volunteers, but also communicate that externally to your consumers and their family members as well. We talked about it being, a culture of safety, and everybody plays a role in this. So, you shouldn't have one individual or certain individuals dedicated to just oversee your abuse prevention policy. It really is something that everybody should be educated on what abuse is, what the signs of abuse are, what their individual role is, what their reporting responsibilities are associated with that. And somebody who has the smallest amount of interaction within an organization could see something, could speak up and say something, and that can be the difference between preventing an incident or not preventing an incident. And then we want to make sure you have very clear reporting guidelines and procedures associated with this. So it's great that you have the policies and procedures in place, but is everybody trained on those policies and procedures? And then in the event of a situation, do you know exactly how to respond to those types of things? So we talk about defining boundaries, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. Does your organization have electronic communication? If so, is that in the form of online activities? Is that in the form of social media activities, gaming, email correspondence, any of those types of things? If you do have those exposures, then obviously you need to make sure you have policies and procedures surrounding those types of things. Does your organization and your programs and services allow physical interaction, verbal communication? What does that look like? How is that controlled? One-on-one interactions. Again, we talk about things that perpetrators need: access, privacy, control. So if some inherent operations inherently have one-on-one exposures. There's just no way to work around that. So if we're not trying to eliminate all these exposures, we're just trying to minimize the risk potential. And if you do have to engage in these activities, making sure you have proper policies and procedures in place associated with that. And then some of the things that goes beyond the programs and services, right? So some of these, you might be working with clients or working with consumers during the course of your daily activities, but sometimes you're in the community, it's a church, it's a school, you might have outside interactions with these people. Are you doing tutoring? Are you babysitting? Are you doing other activities associated with that? So from an organization standpoint, you need to make sure, do your employees engage in those activities? Are there outside interactions with their consumers, beyond the scope of your typical standard hours of operation? And then what is your company's policies and procedures surrounding those types of things? Does it need to be reported? Does it need to be disclosed? Because sometimes those outside activities could start some of the grooming procedures and some of the control aspects of it that might materialize into problematic issues later on down the road. So the next couple of slides, we talk about samples of policies and procedures of what appropriate behaviors are and what inappropriate behaviors are. So the first one, we'll talk about physical interactions. So some of this seems like common sense. You want to try to avoid anything that can be viewed as inappropriate. And it's not just what you organizationally might think is inappropriate. You have to kind of think, what's the public perception associated with this? If you're engaging with people in public or field trips or outings, sometimes somebody who's just an innocent passerby might see something and they might raise a concern or escalate something. So it's something else to keep in mind. But we want to avoid things like full frontal hugs, kissing, sitting on lap, wrestling, piggyback rides, tickling activities. Those are all things that are typically, like those types of interactions should not happen between consumers and staff members from that standpoint. Instead, we make recommendations of using other ways to reinforce, positive activities. Side hugs are acceptable. Pats on the back, high fives, handshakes are acceptable instead of hugs associated with that. Giving verbal praise. So again, just think from an organizational perspective. What are your interactions, and then what is that perception that you want from an organizational standpoint? But again, a lot of these inappropriate behaviors are things that they could be innocent. They don't necessarily have to have bad intentions. But again, the perception, it sets a bad standard for the organization. It also can be very confusing for your consumers or your participants to try to figure out, like, what are they comfortable with, what are they not comfortable with. And then we shift to the electronic piece of it. So again, if your organization has an online presence, social media activities, you have email correspondence with family members or consumers, any of these types of things, some of these can be beneficial for your organization. Again, just trying to think of, like, what are the pitfalls or what things should you avoid? Try to avoid private chats. Try to avoid, one-on-one interactions via email. Employees or staff members friending consumers or participants on social media sites and interacting outside of the scope of their programs and services. So it's always better, you want to steer conversations to a public forum, avoid, individual private chats, or, try to do everything on a group chat. If you're sending email correspondence out, don't just have a staff member contact a consumer or participant directly. Have them copy a parent or guardian, have them copy a supervisor. So again, there's always that multiple people involved in it, so that if somebody sees something, and then there's a paper trail associated with it from that standpoint. So next we move on into screening and selection practices. So why are screening and selection practices important? Again, we talk about what are those three elements: access, privacy, control. Screening and selection is the first line of defense associated with that. Is if you do a good job screening and selection your staff and identifying who's going to be brought into the organization, you're automatically taking a proactive step towards eliminating the amount of access that potential violators are going to have with those vulnerable populations. So it's important to have a formal process, and we'll get into some of the details about what the various steps for something like this should be. But it's important for an organization to have a formal selection and screening process because, again, the violators or perpetrators are looking for the path of least resistance. So if they're trying to look at multiple organizations or reaching out to multiple organizations, they're going to figure out which one has the easiest opportunity for them to get in as quickly as possible and interact with their target population. So if you have those formal screening policies and procedures, it'll weed some of those individuals out. If they come in and say, hey, I've got to fill out an application, I've got to go through a background check, I've got to go through multiple interview process, a lot of times they might just look at it and say, it's not worth the hassle. I'm going to move on to another organization. And so from that standpoint, you've taken a very proactive approach that you've gone into that. It's good from an organization standpoint because you want to assess what your exposures are and what the risk potentials are, and then build your policies and procedures around that. One important thing too is, we ask the question, who should be screened? So, obviously you want to say, hey, we should screen all of our employees. But sometimes, depending on your programs and services, it may go beyond that. Do you use volunteers? Is there a high number of volunteers? What role and capacity are those volunteers playing within your organization? We use the term regular and repeated contact. So any individual who has regular and repeated contact with your consumers typically should be held to that higher standard. And that applies to screening and selection process. If you're going to have volunteers who come in one day a month or a couple times a year, you're probably not going to do that extensive of a background check. But if they're coming in on a regular basis 2 or 3 times a week, have regular interactions with your consumers, you probably should be treating them the same way you would be treating a standard employee from that standpoint. And it even goes on, we'll talk later about training. The same goes for the training, is if you've got those individuals who have that regular repeated contact, you want to make sure that they're trained the same way that a traditional employee would be. So some of the best practices associated with this, so you should have a standardized formal job application associated with that. We recommend a code of conduct that's attached to that, that requires the applicant to sign and acknowledge the fact that they've read that so that they're aware of what the organization's mission is and how you're going to be viewing your policies, procedures, and your abuse prevention program. What do you look for? So you want to look for any gaps or inconsistencies in it. That's why we ask for a multi-prong approach. You want to have those applications. A lot of times the information doesn't come back and it's not 100% accurate. So you want to look for those gaps, inconsistencies, try to find out what's driving that, what is the motivation, or is there a story behind that that's legitimate, or are they trying to mask or hide something that potentially could be a red flag behavior. Face-to-face interviews are great. Again, the application is a great starting point, but especially when you're trying to promote your mission and you're trying to qualify people and find out how are they a good fit for your organization. Do they share your same beliefs and your same core benefits? Those face-to-face interviews sometimes are hard to replicate or replace. Again, talking about the multi-prong approach, we do also recommend doing reference checks, both on a sampling of personal references as well as professional references, just because that will give you as broad of a background experience. So sometimes a friend or a personal reference might give you one story, a professional reference might paint a different picture from that standpoint. So you just want to make sure you're using all of the tools at your disposal and getting as broad of a picture of information to base your hiring decisions. And then with regards to the interviews, we talk about using behavioral-based interview questions. And if you're not familiar with what a behavioral-based interview question is, there's a couple samples on here, but like these are your questions in an interview. Give me an example of, describe a time when, how would you respond to this type of situation? So the intent of those behavioral-based questions is using prior behaviors as a predictor for future behaviors. And so that can be very beneficial when you're trying to select your staff members. Next, we talk about criminal background checks and why are criminal background checks necessary. And a lot of organizations look at and say, oh, we do criminal background checks, but how extensive of a criminal background check is. Or are you using a criminal background check in lieu of face-to-face interviews or in lieu of a formal application process? So again, when we talk about the screening and selection process, it's really multiple aspects of it that are used collaboratively to achieve the results associated. So sometimes, why do people run background checks? Well, sometimes it's required. Their license, their certification, their accreditation might require them to be running background checks on, or it could just be a state requirement or standard. It's important from an organization. Why would you want to run a background check, right? If you don't run a background check and then it leads to an incident, is you could be held liable for something that was readily available. Like had you run a background check and had you been able to discover that they had a checkered past or were involved in some unfavorable activities, you could be held accountable for that. And somebody would come back and say, hey, you should have run this, you should have known about this, you had every opportunity to do it, you still brought them into your organization, we're now going to hold you accountable for that. It also keeps the offenders out of the organization. Again, we talk about path of least resistance. If you're telling somebody ahead of time that, yeah, you're going to interview with 2 different people, you're going to fill out an application, and we're going to do an extensive criminal background check. If they don't have good intentions and they're trying to get into your organization simply to access those vulnerable populations, you're probably never going to hear from those individuals again. And then we talk about the statistics. So I always thought this was a staggering statistic. Nearly 50% of applications, employment checks, education checks come back with some level of discrepancy associated with that. So again, I think from an organizational standpoint, it's just doing your due diligence and making sure that the information, if it sounds too good to be true, maybe it is too good to be true. So So what are some of the policies or what does a good criminal background check screening process look like? So really, we recommend 4 components to it. So, we recommend a Social Security search. We run a national sex offender search, a county level search for any county that the applicant has lived in over the last couple of years, as well as a multi-state criminal database. And again, you want to cast as large of a net as possible. A lot of people just want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say, hey, we operate in this city or we operate in this county. They've lived and been a resident of that county. We don't need to go any farther than that. But as history has shown, is some of these individuals do move around a lot. They might change social security numbers. They might change their identity. They might falsify documents. They might move from city to city, from state to state. So when you run just a local search, you might come back and say, hey, this person has lived here for 2 or 3 years and they're not on anybody's radar screen. Everything seems to be free and clear. But then you find out that, okay, well, 5 years ago they lived in a neighboring state and they were involved in allegations or had criminal activity on their record from that standpoint. So again, organizationally how do you protect yourself? Cast as large of a net as possible and try to collect as much information as possible. And again, you're not going to do this on every single employee. I think you have to weigh the balance of who are these individuals, what role are they going to play within your organization, how impactful is that role going to be within your organization, and obviously the ones that are higher up in leadership or have more interactions or play a more integral day-to-day role in your organization and activities are obviously you want to make sure you focus in on those individuals. So we talked about the steps, so this really just puts it in kind of a continuum.
Pat, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
How often should background checks be completed, only before hire or throughout the week?
So we recommend typically, it should always be done at hire. That should be the minimum standard. But then we usually recommend for employees, and again, those regular repeated volunteers, at least every 3 to 5 years after hire from that standpoint. So again, sometimes that will vary, but yeah, best practice is typically every 3 to 5 years. So this just kind of puts the continuum for the hiring practice on there. Set very clear expectations up front. How long are you going to conduct the search? How are you going to conduct the search? Who's going to be responsible for conducting the search within your organization? Are you then getting the applications? Are you doing face-to-face interviews? Are you doing reference checks? Are you doing background checks? And if you follow all of these steps, you're putting yourself in the best possible position to limit any potential exposures in the hiring or screening process. The next step in the safety equation moves on to training. So obviously, once you've gone through the screening and selection process, you've brought them on board. Now we're dealing with training. So why do you want to do training? Well, obviously it educates your staff in areas of prevention and detection of abuse and molestation. Training is something that is beneficial not just for your own staff, but it's also good for some of your consumers and participants, depending on their level of interaction and their capabilities from that standpoint. We're seeing a huge influx in peer-to-peer activity associated with this. So a lot of times organizations look at, when we talk about abuse, people automatically want to assume sexual abuse, molestation, or sexual misconduct. We view abuse as being a much broader realm than that. It's not just sexual contact, it's physical contact, it's also mental abuse from that standpoint. And it's not just adult to child, employee to consumer. We're starting to see more and more consumer to consumer, youth to youth, peer to peer types of activities associated with that. Does your organization have a mandatory reporting requirement? If so, what does that look like? Who's responsible? Is that being communicated to everybody within your organization? Are they aware that they're a mandatory reporter? Are they aware of what the standard protocols are of how it should be documented, how it should be escalated, when to notify authorities, and things like that? To the question, when should training be done? It should always be done as part of the hiring process. We like to see a separate abuse prevention training aspect of it. We don't just want to say, hey, we just train on general policies and procedures and maybe we gloss over abuse prevention. We would prefer to see organizations that focus specifically on providing training and resources in the abuse prevention status. But even from a training standpoint, we talk about doing the background checks at hire and then repeating them on some level of frequency. Training is the same way. We want to do training at hire, and then we recommend doing the training on an annual refresher basis or as needed throughout the organization. This next one kind of seems like a no-brainer, but anybody who's working with these vulnerable populations, and when we say vulnerable populations, we're talking about youth, elderly, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Nobody should ever be brought into an organization allowed to interact with the consumers or clients before they've been trained on abuse prevention or the policies and procedures. And so sometimes we see that. You don't want to bring them in and put them on a probationary, and like we'll get to the training when we get to it, is they should always be set aside, have clear expectations of what their roles and responsibilities are before they're allowed to interact with those individuals. And then the frequency of training, we'll talk later about high-risk activities and some of these types of things. Is training should be an ongoing thought process, right? So if it may not be something that's going on within your organization, but maybe you see something on the news. Maybe you hear rumblings from a competing or neighboring organization who's going through a challenge or is wrestling with a false allegation. Those are all learning opportunities for any organization. So, when you get those opportunities, take advantage of them, get in front of do a quick refresher, make sure some of the high-risk activities, are things that, again, that there's an elevated risk for an abuse situation to apply. And sometimes it's like we haven't done training in 6 months or 9 months, and now we're going to do an overnight field trip, or we're going to be transportation, or we're going to be doing some higher risk activity that has a higher probability of abuse to occur. You want to make sure you're addressing that from a training standpoint ahead of time.
Okay, so moving into the second segment for monitoring and supervision. So if you're following along on the matrix, we're moving into that middle section. Monitoring and supervision is critical, and this is when we're talking about the entire organization being fully committed to abuse prevention. This is where it really starts, right? Everyone knows the adage, right? If you see something, say something. This is what we're talking about with monitoring and supervision. Everyone's on board in regards to access, privacy, and control concerns. We want to decrease opportunity for privacy. Again, Pat talked about there's organizations that you're going to have one-on-one exposures, right? But how do you make those more favorable? With windows in the doors, with video surveillance in vans, understanding the last person that's being dropped off, how long is that individual alone with a driver? Does there need to be another person that maybe does random ride-alongs, right? Again, just mixing up the potential of having a predator have that access with the participants is critical. And then it really protects everybody. Everyone's on board as far as managing and monitoring the facilities, and then having that level of supervision with employees and volunteers is critical, right? So if you decide as an organization not to run background checks on your volunteers, right, because they have limited participation with their clients, that's great, but then you need to make sure that's being truly followed, right? That the volunteers don't have time with your clients, and that there is, and if they do, that there's someone that's actively supervising them that's on site. Areas that we see as high risk, overnights, bathrooms, locker rooms, aquatics. Aquatics is a huge area, right? Anything that you have individuals being vulnerable in regards to, changing. There's opportunities, especially with peer-to-peer around, bullying or even a sexual harassment pieces or beyond just sexual abuse. Anything that's around personal care, right? Do you have someone in the organization that, readily raises their hand to take care of the, personal care items of your clients? That's a red flag, right? Making sure that everyone's in rotation and that there's not just always one individual that is taking care of that. Transportation, we talked about, periods of transition, so downtime, right? Where you've got kids that are maybe in an organization that have, some time for free play in the gym, and they readily go out a back stairwell, right, that no one's supervising or sweeping. Those are dead areas, what we call them. That's really important for your organization to know what those are and make sure that those are part of the supervised areas and that those are controlled. An area that we see a booming, unfortunate percentage of incidents is mixed age groups. And so obviously within your organization, you may not be able to totally control the span. However, whatever you can do to break them down into more appropriate age ranges or development levels is critical. That way you're keeping your participants safe, and you don't have a potential of a perpetrator that is older and in the teens, being around 7, 8, 9-year-olds consistently, having access, right? Something to really kind of consider. And then obviously youth counselors, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? Some of these are obvious, but again, with the rise of peer-to-peer, we want to make sure that we're highlighting these and talking about them as well. Monitoring and supervision, this is areas that we want you to continue to think about for your risk. So isolated areas, playgrounds. Do you have a line of sight to those areas for those playgrounds, right? Are there, again, dead zones within the playground or areas that you need to, make sure that people are monitoring? Are your playground monitors or other individuals, are they actively monitoring, or are they sitting outside on their phones, right? Again, that's an area of coaching and supervision for you to continue to have everyone in your program be fully committed to abuse prevention. Other areas that we want to talk about as far as managing the higher risks are structured activities at all times, right? Like limiting the downtime, maintaining ratios, making sure that you have appropriate ratios and coverage for all of your activities. Separate age groups we talked about, zero tolerance, right? And then limiting one-on-one exposures, making sure that you're not putting anyone in a position, to have that one-on-one exposure and something go awry. Conditions that may increase the risk, program characteristics. Maybe you run a small nonprofit and you service a bunch of individuals of all various ranges, and it's just not realistic for you to break out into smaller groups. Okay, fine, but then what are your policies and procedures and controls around monitoring and making sure that everyone within the program is safe? Programs outside of a core competency, again, we know that states, federal government give grants, right? We see this a lot where maybe you're given an opportunity to expand some offerings in your risk, and that's wonderful, but do you have expertise in those areas? Are there people that you could lean on to help you do some advisory to ensure that you're thinking of all of the things that could happen with that additional that program that you're trained over. High turnover is something that we look at as an underwriter. Programs that have significant high turnover obviously are concerning because we don't have that consistent feedback model and training, and we want to make sure that we kind of limit that high turnover, creating a culture and creating an organization that people want to remain in and truly build and be part of is critical too. Anything that's heavily volunteer based, again, you guys rely on volunteers in so many of the programs and services that you provide, which is wonderful. But again, making sure that it's appropriate for level of your volunteer checks being done, how they're monitored, all those things are really important. And then externally accredited, CARP accreditation, other accreditations are wonderful, right? But is focus being put on that to get that accreditation, or is focus being really to make the organization a place where abuse is prevented? Like, where's the focus of the organization going from top down, right? And everyone being on board. Just things to think about. Examples of potential boundary violations, staff raising voices, failure to complete documentation and attending staff meetings, the old adage, we're too busy. I'm too busy to attend the training. I'm too busy to do this. Well, that's a red flag for you and a coaching opportunity for some of your staff members. Failure to report incidents. So many times, Pat and I have looked at accounts that have come through and we've had an incident that is reported late, or an individual saw something but they didn't say something. We talked about the grooming statistic of 14 interactions. So there was 14 interactions somewhere within the organization that someone could have seen something and said something and it didn't happen. And so it's really important that you guys are thinking critically about those boundary area violations and that everyone feels comfortable talking about them. Other areas are teasing or belittling, playing favorites, or roughhousing, just overall being immature, sexual jokes, things like of that nature, right? Those are all areas of just something, to kind of have that red flag go off in your head and be mindful of that area. Consumer participation best practices, really important if your organization has programs where you need to have, children or maybe developmentally disabled, and you've got parents and guardians that need to all be interacting. We love to see within that handbook guidelines for everybody, right? Get it out there so that your parents, the guardians, the participants, when it makes sense, all know what the rules and code of conduct are. I always go back to the slide that Pat shows of what's appropriate and inappropriate, right? About side hugs or high fives, right? That should be common language for everyone within your organization. Everyone knows that high fives are great, but frontal hugs are, not within the purview of our program of what we do. Again, going back, like having all of those communications with everyone where it makes sense is critical. We see that area really being missed a lot. And another area that we see within policies a lot is a miss, is that it's really more of a sexual harassment policy that is talked about in regards to your staff. So you've got a great sexual harassment policy, right? But take it that step further. That's one component of it, but now we need to talk about abuse and molestation and prevention in that segment, because they really are two different things. And making sure that with the consumer participation best practices, that it's age appropriate, it makes sense for your organization, for their role. Again, a lot of this is common sense, but we'd just like to put it out there as areas to think about, so you can kind of find the areas of opportunity in your organization.
And so I think one thing that's important to note with consumer participation is, the Praesidium report has a lot of valuable information in there. A lot of organizations self-report to Praesidium and kind of, look internally at themselves and say, hey, where are we strong? Where are we weak? Consumer participation consistently is probably one of the ones that organizations, they look at themselves and say, hey, this is an area we could all do better from this. So it can be a very difficult challenge to get the consumer participation involved. And there's a couple of different reasons why consumer participation is valuable, right? So it's not just about educating your staff and your employees and making sure you have the right policies and procedures. Because there is such a high frequency of peer-to-peer activities, is you want the participants to take an active role in their safety as well. Yep. And so if they're involved in the process, then they feel more comfortable with it. They know that they have a platform available for them to speak up and say something or address a concern that they have. Their families know that they have a platform to speak up and get involved in those activities. And again, then you as an organization feel much more comfortable saying, hey, we've tried to really promote this safe environment, and we're communicating that and allowing that everybody knows that, yes, this is a safe environment. There are no repercussions. If you see something, say something from that standpoint. So there's a ton of different resources available for this. And this is going to vary from organization to organization. It's also going to depend on the types of clients you have, the age groups that you're dealing with, as far as what resources might be appropriate for your organization. But we just threw a couple samples on the slide here. Aaron's Law was something that was enacted a few years back, which basically now is a mandatory requirement for public schools to be providing some sort of abuse prevention. That does also include education for the parents and the guardians from that standpoint. And then it does outline or provide some guidance for age-appropriate materials, depending on the age of the kids. But we have a broader selection of some of these resources, and obviously we can always reach out, or you guys can reach out to us. We can share some of those informations that might be more specific to your individual organization. But we've got school-age children. We've got programs and resources for teenagers. We've got resources for people with special needs. and those types of serving organizations. So again, just kind of be aware there is no shortage of information out there, whether it's online materials, whether it's websites, whether it's print materials, or things that specifically address abuse prevention, both from an internal standpoint to educate your staff, as well as the external for family and members and your direct consumers. So we talk about reporting, and so like we've talked about 80% of cases go unreported. And so like what are some of the hurdles or roadblocks to why people don't report? And again, some of these seem pretty straightforward. Shame, guilt, embarrassment. Like they don't want to admit that this happened to them. It can be a very traumatic experience. It can be a very difficult situation. And so like, yeah, they don't want to be vocal and say, hey, this happened to me, because sometimes it makes them be viewed as weak. And they don't want to have that perception associated with it. They can be afraid that they're not going to be believed, especially when you're dealing with younger children. It's just like, oh, well, if I'm now making an allegation against another student, or I'm making an allegation against a respected person in the community, a teacher, a coach, a pastor at a church, they're never going to believe me as a kid. They're going to always take the word of those individuals. Again, we talked about the trauma piece of it. They could put this out of their memory. They want to forget about it. They don't want to recall the facts or the circumstances of it. And if they're struggling with that internally, that could be a roadblock or a hurdle for them to be able to comfortably reach out to somebody and say, hey, this happened to me. I need to have a conversation, or I need to address it in some level of experience. Sometimes it's just education. They may not know that it was a situation of abuse. Again, when we're talking about the different definitions of abuse between how we define it versus how some of our competitors define it, or what an industry standard for it is, it's going to vary. So imagine now you're putting a consumer or a participant in a position where they're trying to interpret, like, was this actually an act of abuse, or was it not an act of abuse? And so that can be hard. And then always, there's the retaliation aspect of it. If I make an allegation and it turns out that it's not, substantiated, how is that going to affect me? How is that going to affect the organization? So a lot of times it's just trying to overcome those challenges. It's always better to report than to not report it. And just making sure that everybody within the organization is aware that that's the mindset from that standpoint. So then we get into what does incident reporting and responding look like. So there should always be a written procedure associated with this. Anytime that there's a potential incident or something is reported, somebody says something, somebody brings something to your attention, we always want to document the incident. And then we want to make sure we're following standard protocols associated with this. If it's an incident involving an organization and an employee, like, do you have policies and procedures that says, are we removing that person from a situation until we can investigate it? Are you limiting access? What is the disciplinary process associated with this, as far as, are those people allowed to still be retained as a staff member? And if so, in what capacity associated with this? One of the big issues with incident reporting is trying to figure out, like, what's the root cause of it, right? So, I mean, is this an isolated incident that was just a one-off anomaly and, we never saw any warning signs or indications of it? Or has this been brewing? Has this been an ongoing exposure, and it now just finally, boiled up to a head? Obviously, you want to cooperate with any kind of authorities. If there's law enforcement involved, you might need to prepare a media statement. And so again, from an organization perspective, like, you never want to be caught off guard from the standpoint if a situation arises and you're now trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to respond? What are our policies and procedures associated with this? You want to have a very clearly defined path. Hopefully you never have to use it. But at least then, if you find yourself in a crisis situation, you know exactly the steps to go into that. And then lastly, you want to notify legal counsel. You want to work with your insurance companies to address any potential coverage or legal ramifications associated with that. One of the things we put on here, and it kind of just speaks to the empathy aspect of it from an organization standpoint, is you always want to reach out to the person who reported it and thank them for reporting it. Bringing it to your attention. Again, sometimes it could be a severe issue, sometimes it couldn't be a severe issue, but You want to promote that type of activity and show people that, yes, this is what we stand for organizationally. We want you to say something. We want you to speak up. You know that it can be a very difficult, challenging time for these people to step up and make an allegation or report an incident. So you want to make sure that you understand what they're going through and thank them for bringing it to your attention so you can make your organization a safer platform. So we talked a little bit about the root cause analysis. I think this is a good example to kind of show, like, hey, there's a scenario, and then as you go down through the progression, you start asking some questions about the scenario and realize, like, hey, maybe this is much more widespread of an issue than we had. So it starts here, there was an incident involving 2 children who sexually acted out. You start asking questions, well, why did they act out? Well, they were left alone in a bathroom. Okay, well, don't just accept that as the fact. You ask, continuing questions. Well, why were they left alone in the bathroom? Well, the staff weren't supervising them. Okay, well, if the staff wasn't supervising it, why weren't they being supervised? Well, it turns out they didn't follow the policies and procedures of the organization. Well, why weren't they following the policies and procedures? Turns out they didn't know there was a policy and procedure to follow. So you get down to the root cause of that and say, like, yes, there were elements of this exposure, but now that you've uncovered a much larger issue within the organization where you now is an opportunity to do a refresher training, maybe revamp your policies and procedures, re-educate the staff that these policies and procedures exist. So sometimes you just look at it and say, you just want to treat the incident itself, but sometimes the incident might be evidence of a much deeper issue within the organization. And then is your board on board? So you've heard us on some of these slides, and we talked about it building a culture of safety. It's not just one organization, it really is from the top down, and everybody plays a role in this organization. So that starts with the board of directors, for organizations. Oftentimes the board of directors are steering the policies and procedures or the governing policies for those organizations. They control the budget for these organizations. So if they're not allocating resources, then they're not committed and buying into that abuse prevention mindset and policies and procedures. It can be really hard for the people who are actually interacting with the consumers to be able to have those resources available to them from that standpoint. So we really do want the board of directors to be involved in it. And the board has a vested interest in this as well. It's not just the organization. The board could be held accountable if there are violations or incidents that come up through this as well. So if they're not supporting it, they're not allocating those resources, they're not actively involved in those day-to-day decisions and processes, they could be leaving themselves exposed from that situation. And again, it just sets the tone for the organization. Everybody within the organization knows exactly what they're trying to accomplish, what their mission is, how they're going to achieve that. Everybody in the community, everybody who participates in those programs and services feels very confident that this organization is committed to providing the safest environment possible. And then the board is oftentimes involved in the crisis management plan. We talked about having a formal crisis management plan. Again, you don't ever want to have to figure that out on the fly. You want to have that in place. Hopefully, again, like I said, you never have to use it, but better to have it there. And then oftentimes the board of directors is making the decisions on the insurance purchasing. So if they're not involved in the potential risk exposures that the organization has, and they're not aware of the controls or actively engaged in the control process from that standpoint, they could be exposing themselves from a liability standpoint if they're not buying adequate limits of insurance or the right types of insurance. So the last couple of things, a couple of takeaways. So from an organization standpoint, this is where you get to self-reflect and you get to go back and say, hey, I heard all these great pieces of information and we saw all these facts on the slides. It's like, how do we measure up from an organization standpoint? So ask yourself, do we screen all employees and volunteers? If so, what do those policies and procedures look like? What steps are we following? Are we following the recommended continuum, or are we just doing select aspects of it? Do we have a written abuse prevention policy, and do we have a sexual harassment policy? Katie talked about the fact is we view those as two distinctly different exposures. Abuse prevention is really between the staff at the organization and their consumers and participants. The sexual harassment policy is really between the employer and the employees. And so there is some overlap from that standpoint. There could be some similarity, but they are different policies. And so we do recommend and ask that organizations think about them from a separate perspective and have them built into their policies and procedures accordingly. Do you have a written anti-bullying policy? Again, we talk about peer-to-peer activities are on the rise. And again, our definition of abuse may not be everybody's definition, but it includes sexual abuse, physical abuse, and mental abuse. So when you're talking about peer-to-peer activities, bullying activities, social media activities, all of those things fall under our definition of abuse and molestation. So you just definitely want to make sure you look at your organization. Where do we have those potential exposures? And then are we putting good, solid policies and procedures in place to try to mitigate that risk as much as possible? Do you use social media and have electronic communication? If so, do you have the policies and procedures in place to promote that safety in those environments as well? And then when was the last time you updated your policies and procedures? Is we talk about frequency of doing some of these things and making sure you're doing screening and you're doing re-screening and you're doing training on a regular basis. If you're just using the same policies and procedures that you used 5 or 10 years ago, there's been a number of emerging issues in the field of abuse and molestation. Your organization may have gone through shifts and changes. You might have added programs and services. You might have removed programs and services. You might have turned over your staff. All of those are opportunities to reevaluate your abuse prevention and making sure it's still accurate and current and up to date based off your programs and services. And continuing with that, do you provide training? Again, the recommendation is you're doing at least on an annual basis. So again, this is a repeated, everybody plays a role in this. You just want to make sure you're getting out in front of this and making sure that everybody is pulling in the same direction and that they're aware that they are actively involved and they could be the difference between an incident occurring or potentially preventing it. And then do you have a written crisis plan to address? And then the last one, the takeaway, we talked about the spectrum, the complacency, compliance, committed. This is an opportunity to go back, look at yourself in the mirror, evaluate your organizations and say, where are we on this spectrum? And then what can we be doing to potentially make ourselves a stronger organization? With that, turn it back over to Katie.
All right, we're bringing it home. Thanks for everyone's time and going through these pieces. We'll close this up. So we asked you to reflect on your organization and areas that you could make some improvements in and getting everyone into that area of being fully committed of abuse prevention. Here are some additional suggestions. So when we look at characteristics of a culture of safety, these are the things as an underwriter and as an insurance carrier that we like to see when we meet with organizations, with our loss control team, risk management, and when we're reviewing a risk that comes in, when we're looking at the supplemental applications, the policies, procedures, handbooks, this is what we like to be seeing. And so these are areas for you to, again, go back, reflect, and how you can maybe put some of these pieces of this culture of safety into the organization. Thinking about the key takeaways is really the whole point of today. We opened this up as we wanted this to be reflective. And if you can find 1 to maybe 2 or 3 areas within the organization that you really can resonate with today, we feel that we've made the community and your organization stronger, which was the entire point, right? And if there's areas that you need assistance with, please reach out to your advisor at the Mahoney Group. Please connect with Pat and myself. We're happy to help you in kind of deep diving in and helping you really be ready to kind of do that root cause analysis. Because the biggest thing and takeaway when I did the Praesidium training is that near misses are extremely important for an organization. The near misses are your time to reflect, and near misses are okay, right? That's what we want. We want those near misses to be found, and that's what we're pressing you to really do, that self-reflection of the organization from the top down to everybody involved. Risk management tools. Praesidium offers you so many resources, including employee and volunteer screening selection toolkits. This is powerful because it is based upon scientific methodology. It is unified, right? So everyone that's going through screening or the interview process, everyone follows the same protocols, same questions, right? So that you have everyone on board that's involved in the process. And the best part is that it's built for you from Praesidium. You don't have to create it from scratch. The resources and tools are out there for you. The Praesidium report just came out with a staggering statistic that of the cases that have gone through for settlement, over 46% of them, the root cause analysis all goes back to, and I'll ask the group, what do you guys think? 46% of all the cases go back to what matrix failing? You want to know? Screening and selection. Yes, great job. And that to me is that's your table stake, right? Like that is the bare minimum of 46% of those cases could have been potentially avoided had the proper screening and selection happened from the very start. All the other things are important, but that is your backstop, right? That is like activity item number one to keep your organization safe. And with that, we'll open it up to Nick. And any questions?
Yeah, so the question was, obviously the struggles around getting references and obviously a disclosure of information can be very limited with certain organizations. They just want to verify employment or not provide detailed information. So yeah, this is why we recommend a mix of both professional and personal. It's also why we have the continuum of why it's a multi-pronged process, right? Because if you're just relying on the reference checks, and you're not getting any valuable information out of the reference checks, then really what do you gain as an organization from that standpoint? So we're aware of that, and obviously you want to work within the confines. You can't force somebody to give you information or disclose anything. So I think the takeaway for that is just it's one tool of many that are used in that process, and if that tool doesn't extract or provide you with enough valuable information to make a decision one way or the other, then you just move on and you move to the next step in the process and then rely more heavily on those other opportunities.
I'm curious about the personal reference checks, if that is practiced very frequently.
But it is a company that does the references in the background. So, and one of the agencies here in town engages them to screen all their employees. And part of the screening is personal reference and professional reference.
Yeah, and that's why we don't weigh one more favorably than the other one. It's really just trying to get a mix because something you might be able to extract something from a former employer based off their interactions or how they operate within the confines of that organization. A personal might disclose something completely unrelated to that. And sometimes when you're talking to somebody, like people love to talk. Especially if you start asking them leading questions a bit like, oh, well, yeah, I've known Joe for 20 years, and it's like, he's always loved working with kids, and he especially loves 13 to 14-year-old girls. Like, maybe that's a red flag that's going to come up from a situation that, you wouldn't know otherwise, right? So, yeah, it's hard to do the value of it, and again, I think that's where it comes in. It's one tool, it should never just be the be-all, end-all.
No.
From that standpoint, because sometimes you might get valuable information that's like, oh, I didn't know this, and now maybe that makes me think twice about it or pause for it. Sometimes you just go and say, you know what, this didn't give me any information, so you just move on to the next step in the process. Yeah, so you're absolutely right.
I had a quick question for you, Pat, actually. We do a lot of trainings at the Mahoney Group for our clients, but internally as well. We do a lot of trainings for cybersecurity. We get an email once a month that talks about cybersecurity, and it's kind of more of an awareness thing. So the question is, how often should we be providing abuse training? I mean, is that something that we want to be talking about on a monthly basis, quarterly? I know a lot of the providers in here and in the state of Arizona have some required trainings, but what would you guys recommend?
Yeah, so we recommend at least doing it on an annual basis. But again, I think you have to look at your organization and figure out where are your strengths, where are your weaknesses, what level of interaction, how potentially exposed are we to an abusive situation. And sometimes you might not know. Sometimes maybe there's a few takeaways in here and be like, oh, I didn't realize that we were so exposed on an online activity, or we do a really good job interacting the in-person interactions, but we don't do as good a job with the electronic communication. So I don't think there's a set standard. I mean, I think if you're at least doing it on an annual basis and doing refreshers as needed, I think that's a good starting point. But use those. We talked about the near misses. Use those opportunities as learning opportunities and say like, hey, there was an incident, there was an allegation, we investigated. It's like, let's use that as a platform to get back in front of everybody within the organization and stress the importance of this. And it doesn't even have to be your near misses. Maybe it's something that's in the newspaper or it's on the local news or it happened to another organization and say, hey, that could happen to us. Let's proactively get out in front of this from that perspective. So, yeah.
So on the note of training, obviously Nick mentioned that some of the organizations in this room and on Zoom have a state mandated training that they're getting the material for. But are there other resources for training for those organizations that don't have that material that you would suggest is best for training?
Yeah, so we talked about some of the things like, we talked, specifically about some of the consumer participation resources. But yeah, there are resources out there, and Praesidium, can help with that piece as well. So I think Katie threw the slide up there about like the ongoing risk management resources. And we talked about the screening and selection toolkit. There's an Praesidium Academy, which is an online suite of online classes that organizations can sign up, or they can have their employees sign up and participate and engage in those activities. All of those services that were on that slide from Praesidium are available to all selected customers.
Okay.
Doesn't matter if they don't have to be in my realm, which is the community and public services. They don't have to have an abuse coverage. They don't have to. Any selected customer has access to these types of things because we know that the exposures do extend beyond the social services and nonprofit realm. So it could be retail, it could be hotels, it could be golf and country clubs. All have the exposures to abuse and molestation on a much smaller scale from that standpoint. So Praesidium does provide those resources. We make those available to all of our selected customers as well.
Really interesting question. If you also could just repeat it when you answer, please. For electronic communications, should people be doing regular screenings of these messages without staff knowledge or with staff knowledge, and how often?
Yeah, so the question was electronic communication, and should the organization be screening messages associated with it? And I think that's ultimately left up to the organizations to figure out, what their potential exposure associated with this is. But I think a lot of it goes back to building the policies and procedures around it. Is if you don't have the formalized policies and procedures that says, like we're requiring 3 parties to be involved, or we're copying management, or we're copying family members and parents or guardians on all of this correspondence, it might be more important to do kind of a spot check or a random selection of that standpoint. Same thing goes for social media sources. Are you doing social media searches? We talk about, one of the services that Praesidium offers to all of our customers is discounted background checks. And part of that discounted background checks can be doing social media searches. So if you operate a website, or you operate a Facebook page or an Instagram page or a Snapchat page as an organization, is somebody moderating those dialogues, and they're seeing what's being posted on there? What are the comments that are being posted on it? Do you have policies and procedures specifically about non-authorized members within the organization speaking for the organization or making public posts from that standpoint? So that is something that becomes a much more case by case from that standpoint. So if you have it and you don't have as robust of policies and procedures, then I think, yes, having some sort of check and balance on the back end probably would be a best practice to implement.
Any other questions? I have one more. I could ask 100 of them, I swear, but again, referencing cyber liability insurance, we typically will offer an incident response plan. I never thought about it for abuse, and you'd mentioned it on the screen. Do you guys have any templates for that, or any recommendations where to get that type of document?
Yeah, Katie's the coverage expert.
Thank you. Yes, we do. Praesidium actually has some samples, as well as our loss, our risk management team has them as well, and we can put that together. More importantly, Praesidium actually has the ability to be available to the client. So when the incident does occur, they have individuals that have been in this space for 30 plus years that have significant experience with allegations and incidents that have occurred. They also have staff counsel that can help and coach the organization through that process.
Well, thanks again to Pat and Katie. Really appreciate you guys coming today.